On the morning of September 13, 1942, Corporal Walter Burak lay concealed in a shallow trench on a grassy hilltop in Guadalcanal, his eyes fixed intently on the dense jungle to the south. Sleep had eluded him for nearly 2 days, and fatigue mingled with adrenaline left his hands trembling uncontrollably. The weight of his rifle seemed unbearable as the tropical sun began its ascent, promising another day of oppressive heat that would drain what little energy he had left. The ridge where he was positioned stretched approximately 1,000 yards in length, sloping upward to form Hill 123, known by Marines as a narrow coral spine emerging from the jungle floor, and covered with knee-high kunai grass swaying gently in the breeze. This vegetation offered ample concealment for potential enemies. Thousands could hide within its tall blades when they launched their next assault. Such attacks were inevitable. Less than a mile away stood Henderson Field, the critical strategic asset in the southern Pacific theater. Though it appeared as little more than an unpaved airstrip measuring 1,500 yards carved from jungle and swamp by Japanese workers and American engineers, this rough patch of red earth and crushed coral was invaluable. Its worth surpassed that of gold or oil. Men would fight to the death for its control. The Japanese were determined to reclaim it, having dispatched 3,000 troops to do so. Burak was one of 840 Marines prepared to defend it against them. The Marines stationed atop this ridge hailed from 2 top-tier units, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion. Both were considered the finest in the Corps. Formed in February 1942 as a specialized operations unit for amphibious raids and jungle warfare, the Raiders consisted entirely of volunteers who had honed their skills at Quantico and in Samoa through rigorous training in hand-to-hand combat, demolition techniques, and small unit tactics. They were lean, tough, and aggressive fighters. The paratroopers, meanwhile, were an even more exclusive group. They had completed both Marine infantry training and jump school and had already seen action on Tulagi in August, sustaining significant losses to secure the island. Only around 200 of them remained, now integrated into Edson's Raiders to bolster the battalion's numbers. Together, these 840 men epitomized the crème de la crème of American combat forces in the Pacific theater. However, despite their elite training and fierce determination, they were severely fatigued, malnourished, and running low on ammunition. During the night prior to September 13th, Japanese troops had launched wave after wave of assaults against their positions. Twice, the Marines were forced to retreat before regrouping and re-establishing a defensive line. By dawn's light, it was evident that the darkness had concealed the extent of the carnage below. The slopes leading up to Burak's vantage point were littered with hundreds of fallen Japanese soldiers. They were scattered in gruesome postures, some lying on their backs while others faced downward in the muddy terrain. A few had perished instantly from gunfire or shrapnel wounds, whereas others had retreated to bleed out amidst the grassy patches. The air was heavy with the scent of blood and gunpowder residue, mingling with the odor of churned earth and the sweet decay of the jungle vegetation. Flies were swarming in dark clouds that buzzed loudly above the persistent background symphony of insects and birds. Burak had never witnessed such a concentration of fallen soldiers before. Although he had participated in combat previously, seen comrades fall, and even taken lives himself, nothing could prepare him for this level of carnage. The scene resembled photographs from the Western Front during WWII. Bodies strewn everywhere, twisted and broken, left where they fell. A few Marines were moving through the area, searching for wounded soldiers and gathering weapons and ammunition. Yet Burak knew that this was far from over. The Japanese had merely tested their resolve. The real assault was imminent. In the coming 18 hours, the outcome of Guadalcanal and ultimately the Pacific War would be decided. The issue at hand was straightforward. The Japanese controlled the Pacific. They had possessed it since December 1941 and ruled over a sprawling empire that extended from China to the Solomon Islands. Their forces had vanquished every Allied adversary they encountered. The soldiers under their command were seasoned, well-disciplined, and utterly dedicated to achieving victory. However, there was one significant advantage held by the Americans: Henderson Field, a rudimentary airstrip on Guadalcanal that U.S. Marines seized on August 7, 1942. This airfield allowed American planes to disrupt Japanese supply routes, assault enemy bases, and safeguard maritime corridors between the United States and Australia. The Japanese military leadership was acutely aware of Henderson Field's importance. Losing it would mean surrendering control over the Solomon Islands, which in turn could result in the loss of their defensive perimeter. Should that happen, they feared an eventual defeat in the war. Consequently, they dispatched their elite troops to reclaim it. Major General Kawaguchi led this Japanese assault force. A 49-year-old career officer who graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, he was a seasoned veteran of battles in China and Borneo. Confident, experienced, and convinced of his success, Kawaguchi had every reason to feel assured. His 35th Infantry Brigade was among the finest units within the Imperial Army. They had honed their skills in China by maneuvering through challenging terrain, launching nighttime attacks, and overwhelming enemy defenses with rapid, intense assaults. These soldiers were seasoned and formidable jungle warriors. Kawaguchi's strategy was meticulously crafted. His plan involved deploying 3 battalions, comprising nearly 3,000 troops, to advance through the dense jungle from the south and east towards the American defensive perimeter. This route included treacherous terrain such as thick vegetation, steep gorges, rivers, and swamps, areas that the Americans deemed impassable. The journey would take several days of arduous marching, with each soldier carrying all their necessities on their backs: provisions, ammunition, and weapons. No vehicles could traverse this challenging landscape, nor could supply lines keep up with them. However, the Americans were unlikely to anticipate an assault coming from that direction, which offered a strategic advantage. The Japanese intended to strike at night when American aircraft would be ineffective due to darkness. Pilots would struggle to navigate in low visibility conditions, and their planes would remain grounded. This setup ensured that the confrontation would be between infantry forces, engaged in close combat under cover of night. In such conditions, the Japanese were highly proficient. They had honed their skills for nocturnal engagements through rigorous training and practiced infiltration techniques. Utilizing darkness as a tactical asset was second nature to them. Kawaguchi aimed to conquer the defenders by leveraging speed and numerical superiority. He intended for his 3 battalions to assault the American perimeter from several angles simultaneously. The principal thrust would be launched from the south, advancing directly up the ridge towards Henderson Field. 2 secondary attacks were planned, one from the east and another from the west. These flanking maneuvers would immobilize American forces, preventing them from reinforcing the primary front. Once Kawaguchi's forces breached the ridge defenses, they would proceed northward toward the airfield. The distance to be covered was less than a mile, which could be traversed in under an hour if moving swiftly at night. By daybreak, the Japanese were expected to take control of Henderson Field, destroying American aircraft on the ground and cutting off any possibility of reinforcements or retreat for the defenders. Kawaguchi's strategy appeared sound. However, it was predicated on an erroneous assumption that there were only about 2,000 American troops on Guadalcanal. In reality, while the number wasn't significantly different, his intelligence was flawed. The American defenses around Henderson Field were indeed thin and stretched across vast expanses of coastline and jungle, with limited supplies and no reinforcements forthcoming. The weakest part of their defensive line was an exposed grassy ridge, roughly a mile south of the airfield, which was barely defended due to its narrowness. This vulnerability was quickly recognized by Kawaguchi. That ridge represented the quickest path to the airfield. If he could secure that ridge and advance northward, his troops would breach the American defensive line directly, reaching Henderson Field in under an hour. However, another individual had already recognized its strategic importance: Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson. At 45 years old, Edson was a seasoned Marine officer known for his bright red hair, which gave him the moniker Red Mike. He wasn't tall or heavily built, standing at 5 feet 9 inches and weighing around 160 pounds. But he possessed an indomitable spirit and resilience. Hailing from Chester, he spent summers working on his family's farm and honed his marksmanship skills hunting deer in the Green Mountains. In June 1916, Edson enlisted with the Vermont National Guard and joined the Marine Corps a year later in June 1917. By October of that same year, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and deployed to France with the 11th Marines during World War I, only to arrive too late for active combat, which deeply frustrated him. Following the war, Edson served at various assignments before enrolling in flight school in 1922 and earning his pilot wings. Yet it was during the Marine Corps involvement in Nicaragua throughout the 1920s and 1930s that Edson discovered his true passion. The Marines were engaged in countering guerrilla warfare, fighting bandits amidst challenging jungle terrain. Edson eagerly volunteered for patrol duty, leading his men on extended missions through rugged mountainous regions to track down rebel leaders and ambush enemy columns. This arduous and perilous work suited him perfectly. In 1928, while commanding a patrol that ambushed an overpowering force of bandits, Edson personally killed several enemies and forced the remainder to flee their fortified positions, earning his first Navy Cross for this feat. In 1929, he returned to Nicaragua for his second tour of duty. There, he patrolled the Coco River area and honed his skills in navigating jungle rivers, surviving off local resources, and fighting in close quarters with limited visibility. For these efforts, he was awarded the Nicaraguan Medal of Merit with a Silver Star. His fellow Marines marveled at his ability to read terrain better than anyone they had ever seen. Edson instinctively grasped how the landscape influenced tactics, predicting enemy movements and positioning defenses accordingly. Known for staying calm under fire and never retreating unless ordered, he was also relentless in his approach. Prior to World War II, he served in China, observing Japanese military operations during their invasion. He meticulously studied their movement patterns, attack strategies, and use of terrain, knowledge that would later prove crucial at Guadalcanal. Before the war began, he had already earned 2 Navy Crosses for his service. Quiet and soft-spoken but utterly relentless, Edson commanded the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, an elite unit trained for amphibious raids and jungle warfare. These Marines were tough, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to their commander, whom they affectionately called Edson's Raiders. On September 9, 1942, he met with Colonel Gerald Thomas, the operations officer of the 1st Marine Division, to study maps of the American perimeter and discuss potential Japanese attack points. Edson ran his finger along the southern ridge near Henderson Field, pointing out that this was where the Japanese would make their next move. However, Major General Alexander Vandegrift, in charge of the division, had a different opinion. He thought an attack from the coast was more likely based on previous encounters. The area around the ridge appeared tranquil and less threatening. Vandegrift intended to rotate Edson's weary raiders into this sector for some much-needed rest. Thomas saw merit in using them strategically instead of merely resting them. Convinced, Vandegrift agreed with the idea that stationing Edson's Marines there would accomplish 2 objectives. providing a respite and bolstering the vulnerable defensive line. On September 11, after securing approval from Vandegrift, Edson led his 840 Marines to take up positions on the ridge. But far from resting, he set about thoroughly examining the terrain, pinpointing firing zones, and devising fallback strategies. The men grumbled in frustration. They were worn out from weeks of continuous combat and longed for sleep and hot meals. Despite their fatigue and complaints, Edson insisted they dig trenches, lay barbed wire, and establish robust defensive measures. His troops affectionately called him Mad Merciless, the morgue master, though there was a hint of admiration in their nicknames. Edson was known for stirring up trouble and pulling his troops into it. On September 11 and 12, Japanese aircraft bombed the ridge from great heights. That very night, Japanese warships pummeled the area with shells fired from offshore. The barrage continued relentlessly for hours. Shrapnel tore through trees, causing them to splinter. The earth trembled under the constant assault. Marines took refuge in their foxholes and implored divine protection. Once the shelling ceased, silence enveloped the night. Suddenly, at 21:00 hours on September 12, Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle's edge south of the ridge. They advanced in successive waves, screaming, firing rifles, and hurling grenades. The Marines responded with gunfire. Machine guns raked through the darkness while mortars boomed loudly. Flashes illuminated the night sky as projectiles whizzed by. The Japanese forces overwhelmed the Marine forward positions. With a numerical advantage of 3-1, they broke through the barbed wire defenses and overran the initial line of defense. The Marines withdrew under fire, maintaining their combat stance throughout the retreat. The Japanese continued their advance, which Edson had anticipated. His troops were strategically deployed with multiple fallback positions in place. As his forward units retreated, they moved to predetermined locations nearer Hill 123. The pursuing enemy fell into a carefully set trap. Marine artillery from the 11th Marines unleashed shells from north of the ridge upon command. Coordinates were relayed by forward observers, and explosions decimated the advancing Japanese forces. The barrage was catastrophic, with bodies scattered and trees splintered, halting the assault in its tracks. By September 14 dawn, the Japanese had retreated into DS sector, retreating to the dense jungle for regrouping. Over 200 enemy casualties littered the battlefield. The Marine losses were significant, 40 killed and over 200 wounded, reducing their effective strength to approximately 830 men. Although they had been pushed back, morale remained high. They had not succumbed. Edson convened a meeting with his company commanders, eating canned hash while they gathered around him on the ground. He shared an honest assessment. They were being tested, he emphasized, noting that this was merely a trial run. They will return, and I want everyone to enhance their positions. Ensure that all wire lines are duplicated. Prepare a hot meal for the troops. Today's activities include digging trenches, setting up wires securely, and getting some rest. We'll need it as the Japanese are coming back, and I aim to catch them off guard. On September 13th, the Marines worked on strengthening their defenses. They deepened their fighting positions, repositioned machine guns, and checked their ammunition supplies. They ate what little food they had left. Despite attempts to rest, most found it impossible due to anticipation of impending events. Edson withdrew his defensive line by 400 yards, concentrating his forces around Hill 123. 5 companies were arranged in a tight perimeter defense. Behind them, Lieutenant Colonel James Keating's 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, positioned a battery of 4.1-inch howitzers to fire directly at the ridge. Forward artillery observers with radio equipment moved closer to the front lines. As evening approached and the sun began setting over the jungle canopy in the west, casting long shadows across the ridge, preparations were nearly complete. Edson ascended onto an old wooden grenade crate that someone had carelessly placed beside his command post. The crate bore weathered, faded black letters reading United States Marines. He positioned himself atop the box so that all eyes would be on him. His weary soldiers began to gather around him, emerging from their foxholes and various combat positions, machine gun nests and mortar pits alike. They appeared disheveled and grimy, their uniforms caked with mud and coral dust. The soldiers looked emaciated and haggard due to sleep deprivation and inadequate nourishment. Many bore bandages on limbs or heads, remnants of injuries sustained in the previous night's skirmish. Their collective scent was a mixture of sweat, gun oil, and apprehension. They regarded their leader with expectant gazes. Edson returned their stares, taking note of each individual. Young men mostly around 20 years old, hailing from diverse backgrounds. Farmers' sons from Iowa, industrial workers from Detroit, and college students from California. These volunteers had put in extra effort during training sessions, surpassing others in their determination and prowess on the battlefield. They deserved to feel a sense of pride, yet at that moment they were visibly fatigued, filled with uncertainty about surviving another night. Edson understood these sentiments well. He recalled similar feelings from his time in Nicaragua, China, and throughout various campaigns leading up to Guadalcanal. Every experienced combat leader experiences this type of anxiety before engaging in battle. What sets them apart is how they choose to channel that fear. He addressed them without raising his voice. His tone remained steady and unemotional, akin to discussing the weather. "Gentlemen, you've performed admirably, and there's just one more request I need to make of you. Can you endure for another night? I understand that we've all been sleep-deprived for quite some time now. However, intelligence suggests that an enemy force will likely attempt a breakthrough here tonight. Rest assured, reinforcements are scheduled to arrive by morning for everyone involved." He paused, scanning the faces of his Marines. A few met his gaze directly while others stared at the ground. All were attentive. This wasn't intended as an inspirational speech or a grand declaration about duty and patriotism. It was straightforward. One more night, that's all I'm asking. You've already held your positions through one night. You can manage another. Assistance will be on its way by morning. He accepted it wholeheartedly, regardless of its veracity. What truly mattered was that his Marines were convinced by him. They gazed upon their leader, noticing the fatigue etched on his face and the unwavering resolve in his eyes. The certainty radiating from him was unmistakable. When Red Mike commanded them to hold their ground, they knew they would do just that. These men had already endured countless trials alongside him. Tonight was no exception. They were ready to follow him once more into battle. Some nodded in agreement, while others simply turned and returned to their stations. There were tasks to be completed. Ammunition needed distributing, fields of fire required clearing, and defensive positions must be fortified. Another night loomed ahead, but they felt capable of enduring it. As the sky darkened on September 13th, the temperature plummeted. Light rain began to fall, intensifying into a downpour. The terrain quickly turned muddy, reducing visibility to just a few yards. Marines huddled in their foxholes, weapons at the ready, eyes fixed on the night sky. Every noise made them jump, and every shadow caused tension. At 18:30 hours, Japanese destroyers began firing from offshore. The Marines detected the distant rumbling first, resembling thunder. Soon after came the whistling sound of incoming shells overhead. This freight train-like noise grew increasingly louder until it culminated in explosions that shattered everything around them. The sky lit up with shell bursts along the ridge. Each detonation felt like a physical impact, shaking their bodies and rattling their teeth. Trees disintegrated into showers of splinters. The ground quaked so fiercely that Marines were tossed about within their foxholes. Dust from coral and earth fell like rain. The artillery assault continued for 20 minutes but seemed to last an eternity. Some shells struck directly in the foxholes, engulfing Marines in eruptions of dirt and flames. Their cries drowned out by the deafening explosions. Others sustained injuries from shrapnel, shell fragments that sliced through flesh at supersonic speeds. Medics crawled between foxholes under relentless fire, pulling wounded soldiers to safety and administering aid with trembling hands while shells detonated all around them. As soon as the naval artillery ceased, a profound silence enveloped the night. This quiet was more unnerving than the explosions had been earlier. In this eerie stillness, soldiers could hear the persistent ringing in their ears and the agonizing cries of the injured. Their own heavy breathing seemed to amplify the tension. They clutched their weapons tighter and gazed into the darkness with heightened alertness, anticipating what was to come. Suddenly, Japanese forces launched an attack from the jungle. Over 3,000 soldiers emerged like specters materializing out of the shadows. One moment there was only the natural sounds of the jungle, birds chirping and insects buzzing. And then suddenly, the tree line erupted into chaos as men poured forth with battle cries echoing across the hills. "Banzai, long live the Emperor!" Their voices rose in unison, creating a cacophony meant to instill fear and paralyze the defenders before any shots were fired. But the Marines remained resolute. They responded immediately by unleashing torrents of gunfire from machine guns and rifles. The sharp crackling sounds of bullets whizzing through the air intermingled with the rhythmic thumping of automatic weapons, all aimed at silencing the advancing enemy. The Moan-Garand rifles provided Marines with a level of firepower that the Japanese were unable to compete with. Boasting 8 rounds per magazine, semi-automatic capabilities, speed, and lethality. Mortars rumbled as shells arced through the night sky, detonating among advancing enemy forces. The din was deafening, a constant roar that obliterated all sense of clarity. The Japanese assault struck Marine lines like a tidal wave. Rifle shots snapped and echoed, machine guns blazed without respite. Grenades burst with bright flashes while men cried out in fury, agony, and fear. Commands were bellowed but swallowed by the chaotic noise. The ridge transformed into a nightmarish tableau of flame and blood, illuminated by muzzle flares and explosions. Enveloped in smoke that stung eyes and throats. Marines continued firing until their rifle barrels glowed red-hot and burned their palms. They hurled grenades until their arms ached and shoulders screamed with pain. When the Japanese closed in, hand-to-hand combat ensued, using bayonets, rifle stocks, entrenching tools, and bare fists. The fighting was intense, ruthless, and desperate. Soldiers grappled in the mud, slipping and falling as they stabbed each other with bayonets and knives. There was no room for thought or fear, only an immediate need to eliminate the enemy before being killed themselves. Some foxholes turned into arenas of vicious close-quarters combat where Japanese troops stormed Marine positions, making encounters personal, intimate, and lethal. Men attacked one another with bayonets, slashed with knives, and battered each other with rifle stocks and stones. The fighting holes were filled with bodies, a mix of wounded and dead American and Japanese soldiers. The Japanese managed to break through the right flank of the Marines, creating a 200-yard gap in their defenses. Through this breach, waves of Japanese infantry advanced towards Hill 123. For an instant, it seemed as if the defensive line might crumble entirely. Should the enemy reach the summit of Hill 123, they would gain control over Henderson Field and potentially win the battle and the campaign. Edson was relentless in his movements, consistently patrolling just behind the front lines, never more than 20 yards away from where the fighting raged. He could have stayed safely at his command post or given orders remotely from a secure location. However, this approach did not align with his ethos. He needed to be amidst the chaos, observing the situation firsthand and ensuring his men knew they were not alone in their struggle. Despite the cacophony of battle, Edson's commands were distinctly heard. "Fall back to our secondary position," he barked over the gunfire. "Reposition that machine gun immediately." He ordered the replenishment of ammunition with precision. His directives were succinct and crucial for the immediate challenges on the ground. Throughout this chaotic period, Edson continuously checked each defensive post, guided counterattacks, and plugged critical gaps in their defense line. As others dove for cover under the relentless gunfire and shrapnel, Edson remained resolutely upright, exposed to the enemy's line of sight, barking orders, and giving directions with unwavering composure. It seemed almost suicidal, yet it was precisely this fearless leadership that inspired his fellow Marines. Despite the constant danger, bullets narrowly missing him, grenades detonating close by, shrapnel whistling through the air, he showed no signs of fear or hesitation. His unyielding presence gave courage to those around him. If Red Mike could face such peril with calm determination, then surely they too could muster the strength to endure. Private First Class Tom Watson, a radio operator lacking formal training as a forward observer, stepped up to take on this crucial role when no other options were available. From his fighting position, he calmly relayed precise artillery coordinates over the radio. Adjusting fire with meticulous accuracy, he directed 105mm shells to rain down upon advancing Japanese troops, causing chaos and carnage among their ranks. Although the enemy assault faltered momentarily due to this devastating barrage, it did not halt entirely. Fresh waves of attackers continued to push forward relentlessly. Watson swiftly made necessary adjustments to his artillery calls, continuing to counter these renewed threats. Additional shells whistled overhead, claiming more lives among the Japanese forces. The Marine fighters in the trenches continued their relentless assault, though their supplies were dwindling rapidly. Many Marines found themselves with just a single magazine left. Edson recognized the severity of the situation and dispatched his reserve company to reinforce the front lines. Marines from Companies B and C armed themselves with bayonets and launched a counterattack against the enemy flanks. This offensive pushed the Japanese back from the ridge. The combat was brutal, with Marines and soldiers engaging in close-quarters battles under the cover of darkness, using knives, guns, and sheer force to eliminate each other. The counterattacks proved successful as they sealed off the breach. The defensive line soon regained stability. However, another wave of Japanese troops attempted a flanking maneuver from the left, aiming to encircle the Marine positions and head towards the longer river. Marine machine gunners swiftly redirected their weapons to target the advancing enemy, causing numerous casualties among the attackers who continued to press forward despite heavy losses. The Marines struggled with dwindling ammunition supplies, reloading repeatedly as they fought off wave after wave of Japanese assaults. From the fallen Marines, they scavenged ammunition and continued firing relentlessly. A Japanese soldier managed to reach the Marine command post and tossed a grenade that detonated near Edson, showering him with shrapnel. Undeterred, Edson calmly drew his pistol and dispatched the intruder before returning to coordinate the defense as if nothing had occurred. Throughout the night, relentless waves of Japanese assaults persisted. Each wave was met with devastating artillery barrages, machine gun volleys, and rifle fire. The Marines refused to give up an inch of ground. Exhausted fighters were withdrawn temporarily for water and then sent back into battle. There were no fresh troops available. Every Marine on the ridge participated in this relentless struggle. By midnight, the rain ceased, revealing a moonlit sky that improved visibility. The Japanese began organizing another attack, but Marine artillery observers preemptively called down fire onto their assembly areas, disrupting the enemy formation. The assault never materialized, Corpses were scattered across the hillsides, and the scent of decay was overpowering. At 1 a.m. on September 14, the Japanese launched their last desperate attempt. Their focus was Hill 123, which they believed would secure victory if captured. 3 battalions advanced up the ridge simultaneously in what became the biggest offensive of the night. The cacophony was intense and overwhelming. The Marines defending Hill 123 unleashed a barrage of gunfire from rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades. Supporting artillery units fired directly at the advancing troops with howitzers set to their lowest elevation, spraying shells like giant shotguns right into the midst of the enemy forces. Explosions erupted among the Japanese lines as the rounds detonated mere feet away. As the Japanese reached the Marines' barbed wire entanglements, they sliced through it and pressed on to the fighting positions. Hand-to-hand combat ensued along the entire front line, with Marines using bayonets, shovels, and even bare hands in their desperate struggle. Casualties were heavy on both sides as the brutal fight continued. The trenches were filled with corpses and blood that mingled with mud and rainwater, transforming the area into a scene reminiscent of a slaughterhouse. Yet, despite the relentless carnage, the Marines remained steadfast in their resolve. They defended each inch of ground with unwavering determination, securing every fighting hole one by one. The Japanese forces were unable to penetrate their defenses or advance further up Hill 123. At approximately 2:30 hours, the Japanese assault began to weaken. By 3 o'clock hours, it had ceased entirely. Retreating into the jungle, they left behind a trail of dead soldiers. As dawn broke on September 14, the ridge fell silent once more. Marines emerged from their trenches and surveyed the aftermath of the battle. The slopes were littered with Japanese casualties, with some estimates suggesting over 1,000 bodies. Precise tallies proved difficult due to the chaos, but the dead were evident everywhere, piled up where artillery had caught them unprepared in open areas, or scattered across the ridge where they fell during close combat engagements. Meanwhile, American losses were substantial as well. 57 Marines were killed or missing, and another 232 were wounded. Of the initial contingent of 840 men deployed to defend Hill 123, a total of 289 became casualties. Several companies had been reduced to just 30 or 40 effective soldiers. The 1st Parachute Battalion sustained such heavy losses that it was eventually evacuated from Guadalcanal 4 days after this battle, never to return. Despite the significant casualties, they managed to hold their ground and protect the ridge. Henderson Field remained secure, and the Japanese assault had been unsuccessful. At 1,305 hours, Major General Kawaguchi led his brigade's remnants away from the battlefield into the dense jungle. His forces had suffered over 800 fatalities in combat, with hundreds more injured. The remaining troops were barely cohesive units. The retreat was a harrowing ordeal for Kawaguchi's soldiers. They marched through the thick jungle without food supplies and faced severe hunger and exhaustion. Wounded comrades cried out with each step as they were carried on makeshift stretchers. Disease plagued those who remained, with malaria and dysentery spreading rapidly among the ranks. Some men too weak to continue were left behind with only a grenade to ease their suffering. As the march wore on, soldiers began discarding equipment to lighten their load. They first abandoned heavy weapons due to sheer fatigue, followed by lighter arms, and finally even their rifles. The jungle paths were strewn with discarded helmets and packs. After 5 days of grueling travel through unforgiving terrain, only half of the original group still carried any form of weaponry when they reached safety. The Kuma Battalion soldiers became disoriented in the jungle and wandered for 3 weeks before stumbling upon Kawaguchi's location. Many perished due to starvation during their arduous journey, while others collapsed under trees and never regained consciousness. A Japanese officer later remarked that Guadalcanal was not merely an island, but a graveyard for the Japanese army. The defeat at Edson Ridge severely undermined Japanese morale. For the first time in the Pacific War, they committed every available resource to capturing an American stronghold only to be halted decisively. Their tactics had proven ineffective, and numerical superiority did not suffice to secure victory. They faced defeat. The Japanese were baffled by their inability to succeed at Edson Ridge. Although they had engaged American Marines previously and typically emerged victorious, something distinctly different was evident in this battle. The Americans fought with unparalleled intensity and resolve, holding ground that should have fallen easily and launching counterattacks where retreat seemed the more prudent course. They refused to yield. From a Japanese viewpoint, the outcome of Edson Ridge was incomprehensible despite their numerical advantage. Their nighttime attack occurred when American firepower was less potent. They employed infiltration tactics that had proven effective in previous engagements. Yet nothing seemed to work. Each offensive attempt met with failure, and every breach was immediately sealed off. By the break of dawn, over 800 fallen Japanese soldiers covered the ridge, while the Americans remained firmly entrenched. In subsequent days, intelligence officers interrogated surviving troops. The testimonies were uniform. American defensive fire exceeded expectations, artillery strikes were remarkably precise, and Marine infantrymen refused to yield their positions even when outflanked. Experienced commanders who had previously achieved success in China and Malaya struggled to explain the unexpected failure. The strategies themselves appeared sound, as did their implementation. However, the outcome was disastrous. A fundamental shift had occurred in how Americans conducted warfare, necessitating a reassessment of enemy capabilities by Tokyo. General Vandergrift later remarked that the Japanese assault on the ridge in September marked the sole instance during the Guadalcanal campaign when he harbored doubts about the ultimate result. Had the attack succeeded, it would have led to the collapse of American defenses on Guadalcanal, potentially forcing a Marine evacuation or surrender. The Japanese had failed to regain control of the Solomon Islands, leaving their momentum in the Pacific diminished. However, 840 Marines managed to defend a crucial ridge against an overwhelming force of 3,000 attackers for 2 nights, accomplishing what many believed was impossible. Edson identified this ridge as strategically significant and convinced his superiors to fortify it. He deployed his troops effectively, set up fallback positions that allowed them to retreat in good order, and coordinated artillery support with precision. During the critical moments of battle, he stood exposed under enemy fire, inspiring his Marines through sheer determination. Kawaguchi's defeat at Edson Ridge had far-reaching implications beyond Guadalcanal. The Japanese High Command in Tokyo was planning a significant offensive in New Guinea, where their forces were just 30 miles away from Port Moresby, the last Allied stronghold on the island. Seizing Port Moresby would have given Japan control of New Guinea and posed a direct threat to Australia itself. However, the loss at Guadalcanal compelled Tokyo to alter its plans. They halted the New Guinea offensive and redirected all available troops and resources to recapture Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Consequently, Japanese forces in New Guinea were ordered to retreat and wait, never receiving another opportunity to advance further. The offensive stalled and came to a halt. New Guinea stayed under Allied control. The Japanese made another attempt to capture Henderson Field. In late October 1942, they initiated an even larger assault with increased troop numbers, enhanced artillery support, and improved strategic planning. This effort also ended in failure. The Americans maintained their dominance. Following this setback, Tokyo abandoned its efforts to reclaim Guadalcanal and started withdrawing the remaining Japanese forces. By February 1943, the island was fully under American control. Historians later recognized the Battle of Edson Ridge as a pivotal moment during the Guadalcanal campaign. Richard Frank, an historian, observed that the Japanese never came closer to achieving victory on Guadalcanal than in September 1942, when they pushed forward along a ridge south of the crucial airfield. If Kawaguchi had succeeded in breaking through at that time, the course of the entire Pacific War could have been altered. For his outstanding leadership during this critical battle, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson received the Medal of Honor. The citation highlighted his exceptional bravery and clear-headed command under intense enemy fire, directing the defense of a reserve position against relentless attackers vastly outnumbering his forces. His shrewd guidance and unwavering commitment to duty enabled his Marines to hold their ground despite heavy casualties on that strategically vital ridge. Edson never sought personal acclaim for his actions. Instead, he attributed any praise to his fellow servicemen. When reflecting on the battle many years later, he simply stated that his troops did what was expected of them. They held the line when it truly mattered. Private First Class Tom Watson, who served as the battery clerk during a critical moment, received a battlefield commission for his actions. Within hours, he transitioned from an enlisted clerk to second lieutenant due to his exceptional performance in directing artillery fire. His precise guidance of the artillery played a crucial role when Japanese forces breached Marine defenses at a pivotal juncture. Several officers who observed Watson's conduct remarked that he performed like a seasoned forward observer despite lacking formal training. During the critical period between midnight and dawn, Watson coordinated 32 separate fire missions, while enemy infantry were less than 50 yards from his position. Throughout this intense combat situation, he remained calm and composed. His radio transmissions were clear and detailed even as grenades detonated nearby, prompting artillery officers to praise his target corrections for their accuracy, comparable to those of highly trained veterans. The ridge where these events transpired was officially renamed Edson Ridge in honor of the commander and his Raiders unit. But to the Marines who fought there, it would forever be known simply as Edson Ridge, the place where they held firm against overwhelming odds at their commanding officer's request. Following this campaign on Guadalcanal, Colonel Merritt A. Red Mike Edson went on to command the 5th Marine Regiment. He led his troops through fierce battles along the Meticulously River and during the fight for Henderson Field in October, where he was promoted to full colonel and later became a brigadier general. After World War II, Edson continued his service and eventually retired as a major general. In addition to military leadership, Edson made significant contributions beyond combat zones. As Vermont's first commissioner of state police, he established a professional law enforcement agency from the ground up, applying rigorous military standards for training and discipline. At the National Rifle Association, he worked diligently to enhance marksmanship programs and promote firearm safety education. Throughout his career, whether leading troops in battle or organizing civilian agencies, Edson consistently demonstrated an unwavering commitment to detail and organizational excellence that mirrored his performance on Guadalcanal. On August 14, 1955, Merritt Edson took his own life at his residence in Washington, D.C., at the age of 58. The circumstances surrounding his death were multifaceted and personal, encompassing health challenges and mental health struggles. He was laid to rest with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Despite his passing, his influence continued. At Marine Corps Base in San Diego, every recruit completes a rigorous 54-hour endurance test known as the Crucible during training at Recruit Depot. The final challenge involves ascending a steep hill named Reaper. At the summit, recruits discover a plaque featuring an excerpt from Edson's Medal of Honor citation. They read it, learn about the Battle of Edson's Ridge, and receive their eagle globe and anchor emblem marking their graduation as Marines. The message is unequivocal. This embodies what Marines are capable of when faced with dire situations, overwhelming odds, or critical moments that demand unwavering resolve. Walter Burak, a corporal who witnessed dawn rise on September 13 from his fighting position, survived the battle. He went on to serve as a runner and messenger for Headquarters Company during subsequent engagements on Guadalcanal. On October 8, 1942, just under a month after the Battle of Edson's Ridge, Walter Burak was killed in action and posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his exceptional bravery. The tale of Edson's Ridge underscores how battles are won not solely through technological superiority or abundant resources, but through leadership that motivates ordinary individuals to achieve remarkable feats. The Marines stationed there possessed fewer troops, ammunition, supplies, and rest compared to their adversaries. Yet they excelled due to superior command, meticulous defensive strategies, and an unyielding determination to secure victory. Edson had anticipated the crucial terrain 5 days before the battle and deployed his forces strategically. Strategic fallback routes transformed a possible retreat into an organized withdrawal, and the seamless integration of artillery support ensured that every Japanese assault met with a barrage of intense fire. When the situation became dire, he remained exposed under enemy fire, demonstrating to his Marines that their leader would never demand what he himself was unwilling to do. The troops at Edson's Ridge were not invincible. They were weary, frightened, and hungry young men, most still in their late teens. They were far from home, battling in a hostile jungle environment against an adversary more than 3 times their size. Despite every reason to flee or surrender, they chose to stay and fight because they believed their commander's orders mattered and trusted him implicitly. 7 decades later, a memorial was established on Guadalcanal at the location of Edson's Ridge, which locals refer to as Bloody Ridge in remembrance of those who perished there. The Solomon Islands government has made efforts to preserve the battlefield by clearing unexploded ordnance and safeguarding historical sites. Tour guides take visitors up the ridge, pointing out defensive positions, explaining battle strategies, and detailing where the Marines held ground against Japanese advances. Much of the area has been reclaimed by nature. Fighting holes have filled in with earth, barbed wire has rusted away, and vegetation has covered many scars left by combat. Yet the contours of the ridge remain largely unchanged, narrow and grassy, rising to the small hill known as Hill 123, which was key terrain for defending Henderson Field. Standing there today, it is clear why Edson recognized its strategic importance as a critical approach route to Henderson Field. An attacking force would inevitably utilize Edson's Ridge, while any defending unit in control of it would dominate access to the airfield. Today, visitors can still identify the defensive positions that Edson set up. Indentations on the ground indicate locations where Marines were shielded by foxholes during combat. The field of fire remains unobstructed, illustrating how Edson strategically placed his machine guns to create overlapping zones of lethal coverage. The landscape itself narrates a tale of tactical brilliance meeting extreme valor. The American triumph at Edson's Ridge altered the trajectory of the Pacific War. It safeguarded Henderson Field and secured Guadalcanal. It compelled Japan to redirect resources from other battles. This victory diminished Japanese confidence and demonstrated that U.S. forces could outmatch their adversaries in close-quarters combat. Each subsequent American success in the Pacific built upon the groundwork established at Edson's Ridge. The soldiers who fought there never ceased to remember it. Decades later, reunions of veterans brought them together again. They exchanged stories, honored fallen comrades, and paid tribute to Red Mike Edson's memory. They recounted the terror, fatigue, and desperation experienced during those crucial days, but also spoke with pride about having passed a severe test under the most challenging conditions. This was deemed sufficient recognition in itself. If you found this narrative as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video to help us share more untold stories from World War II. Join us to stay connected with these often overlooked histories. Every story is significant and deserves remembrance. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are joining us from. Our community includes people from all over the world, bridging different generations and backgrounds. Whether you're a veteran or a history aficionado, you are part of WWII, a unique place that we cherish. Thank you for your participation and for helping keep these stories alive.